tourist was laughing as she posed next to the royal guard. Red tunic, perfect posture, rifle at attention. Just another photo op outside Buckingham Palace. Tour guides called these guards ceremonial only, while crowds snapped selfies. But then her laugh turned to gasps. She clutched her chest and collapsed. Heart attack. Right there on the pavement, the crowd panicked. Someone screamed, "Call 911!" But help was minutes away, and she was dying now. That's when the man they'd been treating like a statue broke every rule he'd sworn to follow. Now, before we show you what happened when that royal guard shattered centuries of protocol to save her life, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The gates of Buckingham Palace, on a typical Tuesday morning, buzzed with that familiar tourist energy. Coaches disgorged visitors from every corner of the globe, their cameras already clicking before their feet hit the pavement. Guidebooks fluttered in the London breeze. Children pressed their faces against the black iron railings, while parents fumbled with phone settings, trying to capture that perfect shot of British pageantry. The morning sun caught the gold detailing on the palace facade, and everything felt like a movie set designed specifically for vacation photos. Standing at his post, Guardsman Oliver Matthews was 6 feet of military precision in full ceremonial dress. His scarlet tunic was pressed to parade ground perfection, not a thread out of place. The black bearskin cap added another 8 inches to his already commanding height, making him tower over the gathering crowd like something from a different century. His SA-80 rifle was held at exactly the prescribed angle, every detail of his posture dictated by centuries of military tradition. To the hundreds of tourists milling around the palace gates, he looked like the ultimate photo opportunity, a living piece of British heritage that existed purely for their entertainment. The crowd treated him exactly like that. Families lined up to pose beside him, children making silly faces while their parents snapped away. A group of teenage girls from Germany giggled as they tried to guess what it would take to make him smile. American tourists compared him to the guards they'd seen at other royal sites, rating his stillness and composure like he was a performance art piece. One particularly bold visitor from Australia leaned in close enough to whisper jokes directly into the guard's ear, then stepped back with a grin, waiting for some reaction that never came. The gates of Buckingham Palace on a typical Tuesday morning buzzed with that familiar tourist energy. Coaches disgorged visitors from every corner of the globe, their cameras already clicking before their feet hit the pavement. Guidebooks fluttered in the London breeze. Children pressed their faces against the black iron railings, while parents fumbled with phone settings, trying to capture that perfect shot of British pageantry. The morning sun caught the gold detailing on the palace facade, and everything felt like a movie set, designed specifically for vacation photos. Standing at his post, Guardsman Oliver Matthews was 6 feet of military precision in full ceremonial dress. His scarlet tunic was pressed to parade ground perfection, not a thread out of place. The black bearskin cap added another 8 inches to his already commanding height, making him tower over the gathering crowd like something from a different century. His SA-80 rifle was held at exactly the prescribed angle, every detail of his posture dictated by centuries of military tradition. To the hundreds of tourists milling around the palace gates, he looked like the ultimate photo opportunity, a living piece of British heritage that existed purely for their entertainment. The crowd treated him exactly like that. Families lined up to pose beside him, children making silly faces while their parents snapped away. A group of teenage girls from Germany giggled as they tried to guess what it would take to make him smile. American tourists compared him to the guards they'd seen at other royal sites, rating his stillness and composure like he was a performance art piece. One particularly bold visitor from Australia leaned in close enough to whisper jokes directly into the guard's ear, then stepped back with a grin, waiting for some reaction that never came. Their tour guide, a cheerful woman with a bright yellow umbrella, gathered her group of 20-something travellers in front of Matthews's position. "Now, these guards you see here are purely ceremonial these days," she announced, with the confidence of someone who'd given this speech 1,000 times. "They're not actually soldiers in the traditional sense anymore. Think of them more as living symbols of British heritage, very well-trained actors, if you will, but their job is really just to stand there and look impressive for visitors like yourselves." The group nodded sagely, phones still clicking away, treating Matthews like he was deaf as well as motionless. A businessman from New York pushed forward with his expensive camera, aiming for what he called the money shot. He crouched down to get the perfect angle of Matthews' boots, then stood on his tiptoes to capture the full height of the bearskin cap. "These guys must be bored out of their minds," he muttered to his wife, loud enough for half the crowd to hear. "Standing here all day while people gawk at them. It's like being a mannequin in a shop window, except the mannequin probably has more personality." His wife laughed, a sharp sound that carried across the courtyard. "At least mannequins don't have to pretend they can't hear us, Ma."
Making fun of them, she stepped closer to Matthews, studying his face with the intensity of someone examining a painting in a museum. "Look at that expression. Absolutely nothing behind the eyes. It's like they train all the humanity out of them." What none of them could see was the way Matthews' trained eyes tracked every movement in his peripheral vision, how his ears filtered through the tourist chatter to monitor for anything that didn't belong, the way his body, despite appearing perfectly still, remained coiled and ready. Because underneath that ceremonial uniform was a man who had spent the last 8 years learning that the difference between decoration and protection was often measured in heartbeats, and the people laughing around him had no
No idea they were standing next to someone who could shift from symbol to saviour faster than they could lower their cameras. But here's what none of those tourists with their cameras and guidebooks knew about Guardsman Oliver Matthews. 3 years ago, he wasn't standing in ceremonial dress outside a palace. He was crouched in the back of an armoured medical vehicle in Kandahar province, his hands covered in someone else's blood, working frantically to keep a 19-year-old lance corporal alive long enough to reach the field hospital. The IED had torn through their patrol like a meat grinder, and Matthews had been the only one with enough medical training left standing when the dust settled. He'd learned combat medicine the hard way, through night courses that ran until 3 a.m. and field exercises that left him exhausted and covered in fake blood that felt too much like the real thing. While other soldiers complained about the extra training, Matthews absorbed every lesson like his life depended on it. Because he'd seen what happened when nobody knew what to do. He'd watched good men die waiting for medics who were too far away, too busy, or too dead to help. So he learned to read the signs of shock, to stop arterial bleeding with his bare hands, to make split-second decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. In Kandahar, with mortars falling like deadly rain, and the nearest proper medical facility 30 minutes away by helicopter, Matthews had performed a field tracheotomy using a ballpoint pen and a knife sterilized with grain alcohol. The soldier lived. 3 weeks later, Matthews pulled a driver out of a burning Humvee and administered CPR for 11 minutes straight until the man's heart started beating again. That man lived too. When his unit rotation ended, Matthews had personally saved 7 lives and indirectly saved dozens more by training other soldiers in battlefield medicine. But the thing about being a medic in a war zone is that you see too much. You learn that the difference between life and death isn't about deserving or fairness or any of the things civilians think matter. It's about timing and training and being willing to act when everyone else freezes. Matthews had requested ceremonial duty, not because he was tired of helping people, but because he needed to find a way to serve that didn't involve watching 19-year-olds bleed out in the sand. The Royal Guard seemed like the perfect place to use his discipline and his training without the nightmares. What he hadn't expected was how much it would bother him to be treated like furniture, to have people assume that because he wore a ceremonial uniform, he'd somehow forgotten everything he'd learned about keeping human beings alive. The red tunic covered scars from shrapnel. The white gloves hid hands that had sutured wounds and restarted hearts. And tucked inside his bearskin cap, where no tourist would ever see it, was a small medical kit that he'd never stopped carrying. Because Matthews had learned something in Afghanistan that no amount of palace protocol could change. When people need help, you help them. Everything else is just ceremony. The morning had the kind of perfect London weather that made tour guides smile and tourists linger longer than planned. Matthews maintained his position as the crowd around him swelled to nearly 100 people, all competing for the best angle, the clearest shot, the most impressive selfie to prove they'd been there. The noise level was rising steadily, a mixture of excited chatter in half a dozen languages, the click and whir of cameras, and the occasional burst of laughter when someone thought they'd detected the slightest twitch or blink from the motionless guard. Sarah Henderson, a 53-year-old high school principal from Columbus, Ohio, was having the absolute time of her life. This was her first trip to London, saved for over 3 years, and everything was exceeding her expectations. She'd spent the morning walking through Westminster, marvelling at the architecture and soaking in the history that seemed to seep from every stone. Now, standing before Buckingham Palace with her husband Jim, she felt like she was living inside a postcard. "This is so much better than Disney World," she laughed, positioning herself next to Matthews for what had to be her 20th photo of the morning. "At least these guys are real." Jim chuckled as he adjusted the camera settings, trying to get Todd the perfect shot. They'd been married for 28 years and he hadn't seen Sarah this genuinely happy in months. The stress of her job had been wearing on her lately, and this trip was supposed to be their reset, their chance to remember why they'd fallen in love in the first place. Matthew's peripheral vision caught every detail of the scene around him, but he remained perfectly still, eyes fixed on the horizon, breathing steady and controlled. He noticed Sarah's slightly laboured breathing, the way she kept adjusting her position, the faint sheen of sweat on her forehead, despite the mild temperature. Combat medicine had taught him to read people's bodies like books, to spot the early warning signs that most people missed. But tourists got excited. They walked more than usual, stood longer than they were used to, and the adrenaline of vacation could explain away almost any minor symptom. "Honey, get one more," Sarah called to her husband, leaning closer to Matthews for what she promised would be the final shot. "I want to make sure we got at least one perfect one." She pressed her hand against her chest and took a deep breath, then another. The sensation was odd, like someone was slowly tightening a belt around her ribcage, making it harder to fill her lungs completely. Probably just excitement, she told herself. All this walking and standing and the thrill of finally being here. But then the tightness became a squeeze. The squeeze became pain. And the pain became something that felt like someone had reached into her chest and grabbed her heart with a fist made of broken glass. Sarah's face went white. Not pale, not flushed, but the colour of old newspaper, grey and bloodless. Her hand moved from her chest to her throat, fingers clawing at the air like she could pull oxygen directly into her lungs by force. Her eyes went wide with the kind of terror that comes when your body suddenly stops following orders. She tried to speak, tried to call for Jim, but the words came out as bare, like a whisper. "I can't," she managed, and then her knees buckled. She hit the pavement hard, her purse scattering contents across the sidewalk, while her husband lunged forward with hands that shook too badly to catch her. "Sarah!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Sarah, what's wrong?" But Sarah couldn't answer because Sarah couldn't breathe. Her lips were turning blue around the edges, and her chest was heaving with the desperate effort of trying to force air past whatever was crushing her from the inside. The crowd's mood shifted in an instant. Excited chatter became gasps of shock. Cameras that had been focused on Matthews swung toward the woman convulsing on the ground. Someone screamed, someone else started crying. A teenager fumbled for his phone to call for help while simultaneously filming the entire scene. And through it all, the questions started flying. What's happening to her? Is she having a heart attack? Should we move her? Where's an ambulance? Somebody do something! But nobody did anything useful. They stood in a circle around Sarah Henderson, watching her die in real time, paralyzed by the weight of a situation they had no idea how to handle. Her husband knelt beside her, holding her hand and repeating her name like a prayer, but even he seemed frozen by the magnitude of what was happening to the woman he'd shared his life with for 28 years. The businessman from New York, who had been so dismissive of Matthews, was now shouting into his phone, trying to explain to an emergency operator where they were and what was happening. "Buckingham Palace! The front gates! A woman collapsed!" But his voice was shaking so badly that the operator kept asking him to repeat himself. The tour guide with the yellow umbrella was attempting crowd control, but her cheerful authority had evaporated in the face of real crisis. A medical student from Edinburgh pushed through the crowd, dropping to his knees beside Sarah. He'd had exactly 18 months of training and had never seen a real cardiac arrest outside of carefully controlled hospital simulations. His hands hovered over Sarah's chest, frozen by the weight of theoretical knowledge that suddenly seemed woefully inadequate. An off-duty nurse from Wales arrived at the scene, having pushed her way through the growing crowd of onlookers. She took one look at Sarah's blue lips and irregular breathing and immediately began checking for a pulse. "She's in cardiac arrest," she announced with authority. "We need to start compressions now." But she was a pediatric nurse, and her experience with adult cardiac emergencies was limited. And through it all, Guardsman Oliver Matthews remained perfectly still at his post, staring straight ahead with the discipline of a man trained never to break formation. But inside that motionless exterior, his mind was racing through everything he knew about cardiac arrest, calculating response times for London emergency services, and fighting against every instinct that screamed at him to move. Because Sarah Henderson was dying 3 feet away from someone who could save her life, and the only thing standing between her and salvation was a protocol that said, "Royal Guards don't break position for anything." Until Matthews heard the sound that changed everything. The wet, rattling gasp that meant Sarah's airway was closing and her brain was about to start dying from lack of oxygen. He'd heard that sound before in Afghanistan, and he'd sworn he'd never ignore it again. "Step aside, please." The voice cut through the chaos with quiet authority. Every head turned to see where it was coming from, and what they saw made them question everything they thought they knew about ceremonial guards. Guardsman Oliver Matthews, H., had stepped out of position. The effect was electric. Tourists who had been focused on the medical emergency suddenly found themselves staring at something they'd been told was impossible. The motionless statue had moved. The ceremonial decoration had become human. The man they'd been mocking and photographing like he was furniture had revealed himself to be exactly what they'd refused to believe he was: a soldier. Matthews moved with purpose, crossing the short distance to Sarah's prone form in 4 measured steps. His rifle remained slung across his shoulder, but his bearing had shifted from ceremonial stillness to professional competence. The crowd instinctively backed away from him, not because he was intimidating, but because he projected the kind of quiet authority that people recognize and respect even when they don't understand it. "I'm a trained medic," he said simply, kneeling beside Sarah. His voice carried just far enough to be heard by the immediate circle of onlookers, but he wasn't performing for the crowd. His attention was completely focused on the woman whose life was slipping away in front of him. The Welsh nurse looked up at him, taking in the red tunic and bearskin cap, clearly struggling to reconcile the ceremonial appearance with the medical authority in his voice. "Are you qualified for emergency cardiac care?" she asked, not moving from her position. Matthews met her eyes with the kind of steady gaze that answered questions without words. "Afghanistan, 2019 to 2022. Combat medic with field experience in cardiac emergencies. I've got this." There was no arrogance in his voice, no ego or bravado, just the quiet confidence of someone who had done this before, under much worse conditions. The nurse hesitated for one more second, then nodded and moved aside. She recognized competence when she saw it, and more importantly, she recognized the kind of calm that only comes from having dealt with life and death situations where hesitation kills people. Matthew's hands moved with practiced precision as he assessed Sarah's condition. 2 fingers to the carotid artery, no pulse. Ear to her chest, no breath sounds. Pupils dilated and non-responsive. Classic presentation of sudden cardiac arrest, probably massive myocardial infarction based on the witness accounts of chest pain and the patient's demographics. Time since collapse, approximately 90 seconds. Brain death begins at 4 minutes without oxygen. He had maybe 2.5 minutes to get her heart beating again. "Sir, I need you to call emergency services and tell them we have a cardiac arrest at the front gates of Buckingham Palace," Matthews said to Jim, his voice calm but urgent. "Tell them we need advanced life support and a defibrillator immediately. Can you do that for me?" Jim nodded frantically, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone. Matthews had given him something concrete to do, a way to help his wife that didn't require medical knowledge. Matthews positioned himself over Sarah's chest, interlacing his fingers and placing the heel of his palm precisely over her sternum. The crowd watched in fascination as this man they'd dismissed as decorative began performing CPR with textbook precision. His compressions were deep enough to depress her chest by at least 2 inches, at a rate of exactly 100 beats per minute. He counted silently in his head, maintaining the rhythm that could keep blood flowing to her brain until more advanced help arrived. 30 compressions, he said aloud after exactly 18 seconds, then tilted Sarah's head back and lifted her chin to open her airway. 2 rescue breaths, each delivered with just enough force to make her chest rise visibly, then immediately back to compressions. No hesitation, no uncertainty. Just the mechanical precision of someone who had done this enough times to know that consistency and timing were more important than strength or drama. The Welsh nurse knelt across from him, watching his technique with professional interest. "Your form is perfect," she said quietly. "How many times have you done this?" "In combat? 15, maybe 20 times, Matthews replied, without breaking rhythm. "Most of them under fire." He delivered 2 more breaths and resumed compressions. "Civilian cardiac arrests are actually easier. No one's shooting at you, and you don't have to worry about IEDs. A police officer arrived on the scene, having been summoned by one of the many phone calls to emergency services. He took one look at the situation, a royal guard in full ceremonial dress performing CPR on a tourist, and immediately radioed for additional support. Matthews ignored the growing crowd and the official complications his actions were undoubtedly creating. Sarah Henderson's life was measured in compressions and breaths, and everything else was irrelevant noise. 2 minutes and 47 seconds after he'd begun CPR, Sarah's body convulsed slightly. Matthews felt the change immediately, a subtle shift in the resistance under his hands, a different quality to the way her chest moved. He paused compressions and checked her pulse, weak but present. Respiratory effort returning, though laboured. "She's back!" he announced to the crowd, though his voice remained professionally calm. "Pulse is weak but steady. Breathing is shallow but present." The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, but Matthews wasn't finished. Successful resuscitation was only the first step. Sarah needed advanced cardiac life support, and she needed it now, before her heart stopped again. The distinctive sound of approaching sirens cut through the crowd noise, growing louder by the second. The paramedics arrived like a small army, pushing through the crowd with their equipment and taking over, the scene with practiced efficiency. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s with 20 years of experience, knelt beside Matthews and began her own assessment. "What's the story?" she asked, immediately recognizing his competence from the quality of care Sarah had received. 53-year-old female, sudden onset chest pain followed by cardiac arrest. Witnessed collapse, downtime approximately 3 minutes before successful resuscitation. Pulse weak but steady, respiration shallow but improving. No obvious trauma, probable MI. Matthews delivered the report with the clinical precision of someone who had briefed medics dozens of times before. The paramedic nodded, already connecting Sarah to a portable EKG machine. "You did good work here. Clean resuscitation, textbook technique. Are you medical?" "Former combat medic," Matthews said simply. He stood and stepped back, allowing the professional medical team to take over. His part in Sarah Henderson's story was finished, but her chances of survival had gone from nearly 0 to quite good, and that was what mattered. As the paramedics loaded Sarah onto a stretcher and prepared her for transport to the hospital, the crowd began to process what they had just witnessed. The man they had spent the morning mocking as a useless decoration had just saved a woman's life with skills that most of them couldn't even comprehend. Cameras that had been focused on capturing his stillness were now recording his return to position, and the footage would be viewed millions of times over the following days. Jim Henderson rode in the ambulance with his wife, clutching her hand as the paramedics continued their advanced life support. Before leaving, he had approached Matthews with tears in his eyes, struggling to find words adequate to thank the man who had given him back his wife. "I don't know how to repay you," he had said, his voice breaking with emotion. Matthews had simply shaken his hand and told him that no repayment was necessary. "Take care of her," he had said. "That's all the thanks I need." The crowd slowly dispersed, but many people lingered, looking at Matthews with a new understanding of what they were actually seeing. The tour guide with the yellow umbrella approached him cautiously, clearly struggling with how to address someone she had spent the morning describing as purely decorative. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I had no idea that you had actual medical training." Matthews looked at her with something that might have been a smile. "No apology necessary, ma'am. Most people don't know what we're trained for. That's rather the point of ceremonial duty, to represent something larger than ourselves without drawing attention to our individual capabilities." The businessman from New York, who had compared him to a mannequin, was standing nearby, clearly overhearing the conversation. He approached with obvious embarrassment, his expensive camera hanging forgotten around his neck. "I said some things earlier that I'm not proud of," he admitted. "I assumed you were just, I don't know, playing dress-up or something. I had no idea you were an actual soldier with real skills." Matthew's expression remained neutral, but not unkind. "We're all actual soldiers, sir. The uniform is ceremonial, but the training is very real. We're chosen for this duty precisely because we can be trusted to represent the military properly, which includes being prepared for situations like this." A small crowd of children had gathered around Matthews, looking up at him with the kind of awe that children reserve for real heroes. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, tugged on her mother's hand and whispered something urgent. Her mother listened, then smiled and nudged her daughter forward. "She wants to know if you're a superhero," the mother said with gentle amusement. Matthews knelt down to the little girl's level, his expression softening in a way that the cameras couldn't quite capture. "No superhero," he said gently. "Just a soldier who happened to know what to do. The real heroes are the doctors and nurses who will take care of that lady at the hospital." But the little girl wasn't satisfied with that answer. "You saved her life," she said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "That makes you a hero." Matthews considered this for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "Then I suppose the important thing is to be ready to help when people need it, isn't it?" The girl beamed and ran back to her mother, who mouthed "thank you" to Matthews before disappearing into the crowd. As the afternoon wore on and the tourist flow returned to normal, Matthews resumed his ceremonial position with the same perfect stillness he had maintained all morning. But something had changed in the way people looked at him. There were still cameras and selfies, but there was also a noticeable reverence that hadn't been there before. Tour guides began explaining to their groups that the guards were active duty soldiers with extensive training, not just decorative elements of the palace. The next morning, Jim Henderson called the palace to inquire about how to contact the guard who had saved his wife's life. Sarah was stable, the doctors had said. Full recovery was expected thanks to the quick and professional medical intervention she had received. They wanted to thank him properly, to invite him to dinner, to do something that would acknowledge the magnitude of what he had done for their family. But Guardsman Oliver Matthews had returned to his normal rotation, standing guard at various royal locations, protecting the symbols and traditions of a nation while carrying the quiet knowledge that he was prepared to protect its people as well. He didn't seek recognition for what he had done, because recognition had never been the point. The point was readiness. The point was service. The point was being prepared to act when duty called. Whether that duty involved standing motionless for hours or saving a stranger's life in front of hundreds of cameras. Would you have trusted the ceremonial guard when the woman collapsed? Think you could have stayed that calm while performing CPR in front of 100 strangers recording everything on their phones? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you know. If this story reminded you that real heroes don't always look like what we expect, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Share this with someone who needs to remember that service members are trained for more than ceremony. More stories about the quiet professionals who protect us in ways we never see are waiting right here on your screen. Click one now, and I'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that the most prepared person in the room is usually the one standing quietly in the corner. Until then, remember, sometimes the person you walk past without a second thought is exactly the person you need when everything goes wrong.